Hey guys, tonight we're slipping back into the foggy dampness of 12th century England, where the stone floors are cold, the bread is dry, and the priests, you'll notice, are kind of crusty. Not just spiritually, but physically. Their hair hangs in greasy tufts. Their robes cling to them with the clinginess of a wet curtain. You can smell the incense and mildew from here, and let's be honest, you probably won't survive this century without lice, a toothache, or being accused of heresy. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge past flickering candlelight, stepping into the nave of a small country church. The stones beneath your feet have seen hundreds of winters, and the echo of your boots makes the saints carved in the columns look twice as judgmental. There's a priest at the altar, muttering Latin, his fingers smudged with ink and something suspiciously sticky. His hair clings in oily curls to his temples, like he's been sweating through his homily, which, frankly, he has. And yet, this isn't sloppiness. This is intentional. See, in 12th century England, priests weren't just discouraged from primping their hair. They were expected to look slightly miserable, because suffering was a sign of sanctity. A clean scalp? That might make people think you had time for mirrors. And God forbid anyone mistake you for someone who cares about appearances. The comb, that simple little object tucked into modern bathroom drawers, was a quiet kind of rebellion. A risk, an accusation waiting to happen. It whispered vanity, and vanity, as any Sunday sermon would remind you, was the slipperiest slope to ruin. You lift a hand to your own head clean, brushed, presentable, and suddenly feel a little guilty. Back then, physical cleanliness and spiritual cleanliness weren't best friends. In fact, they barely spoke. A priest who spent too long on grooming might be suspected of other indulgences: rich food, fine fabrics, heaven forbid, flirtation. Historians still argue whether this attitude came from genuine theology or sheer paranoia about appearing too secular. But whatever the root, the result was clear. Greece was godly. Now, don't get too smug. The average layperson wasn't exactly living in a spa either. Most folks bathed maybe once a season, if that. Still, the clergy had a particular reputation to uphold. Their discomfort was part of the brand. It reminded the flock that their shepherd had chosen suffering. So when parishioners watched a priest with sagging eyelids and clumpy hair deliver communion, they saw not laziness, but sacrifice. Ironically, there was a beauty standard hidden inside the ugliness. The monastic ideal was visual austerity. Picture it: patchy tonsure ring, eyes ringed with fatigue, a hint of musty wax clinging to the robes. That was the medieval priestly glow-up. Here's where things get awkward. Comb technology wasn't exactly advanced, but it was everywhere. Carved from bone, horn, or wood, often with ornate details. Monks made them. Peasants traded for them. Nobles had theirs inlaid with silver, but a priest? If you were caught slipping one from your sleeve after Vespers, well, someone might have thoughts. Which brings us to a little-known tidbit. Many priests did carry combs, quietly, especially those assigned to courts or cathedral cities. The tension between holy expectation and personal maintenance simmered just beneath their woolen collars. Some used their combs only in private, before extinguishing candles. Others gave them up entirely, choosing instead to finger comb and mutter songs of resistance. There's a letter from the period Anonymous, of course, where one cleric describes a colleague who devoted more time to his hair than to the Stations of the Cross. Ouch. Passive aggression has always been timeless. Walk outside the chapel with me now. The wind howls across the churchyard, shaking the yew trees. There's a scent of smoke and frost. Behind the stone walls, a young deacon practices his sermon. He pauses, runs a hand through his tangled hair, and reaches for the forbidden thing tucked in his sleeve. A quick comb. Just once. Then he freezes. Footsteps. Another cleric passes by, eyes narrowed, cloak billowing. Nothing is said, but the tension hums like the iron bell that will ring at dawn. This world is obsessed with discipline, not just in action, but in appearance. Clean hair? That's effort, and effort implies ego. Better to appear burdened, undone, humble, whether or not you're secretly brushing your beard behind the altar curtain. That's between you and your conscience. The church wanted to craft an image, after all, not just pious, ascetic, and nothing says world renouncer like a scalp so dry it could catch fire. Some historians even suggest that clerical discomfort became a kind of spiritual currency. The dirtier your cassock, the holier your presence. Think of it like the early Instagram filter. Visible misery equals authenticity. But this came at a price. Physical discomfort often blurred into resentment. Priests who felt unfairly scrutinized might double down. You'll see that in a later section, when councils start screaming about fringe lengths. For now, though, you're just starting to notice how deeply this runs. A single object like a comb could unravel your reputation, could make your fellow priests question your humility, could even get you disciplined, reassigned, or ridiculed. And yet, they weren't banned outright. That's the maddening thing. Nowhere in canon law does it say, no combs allowed. But the tone of the church, the mood of the councils, the whispers in the vestry, all of it made clear. If you need one, you better be discreet. So you leave the chapel, candlelight behind you, wind tugging your hood, and the knowledge pressing on your chest. In 12th century England, a priest's comb wasn't just grooming gear. It was a liability. And that hair oil on the altar boy's fingers? Don't even ask. You walk past the chapel's stone threshold and back into the cold mist of the English countryside. But the whispers you just heard follow you. The idea that a tiny, innocent comb might be spiritually dangerous sounds absurd from the comfort of your soft pillow. But in this world, it makes a twisted kind of sense. Because tonight, you're entering the mind of the medieval clergy. And in that mind, vanity isn't just a character flaw. It's a direct assault on the soul. So, let's talk about that comb again. To you, it's practical. Removes tangles. Keeps you presentable. Maybe it's even a ritual mirror. Part, fluff, done. But in the 12th century, especially inside the walls of a church or monastery, a comb was like an apple in Eden. It hinted at pride, suggested you were trying to make yourself pleasing not to God, but to people. And that was dangerous business. It wasn't the object itself, really. It was what it implied. Combing your hair meant you'd looked in a mirror, or worse, cared about what you saw there. The church had words for this. Superbia, or pride, was considered the first and most fatal of the 7 deadly sins. The gateway drug of spiritual downfall and grooming, that was vanity's wingman. Historians still argue whether clerics genuinely believed that combing hair led to moral ruin, or if it was just a symbolic line in the sand, a way to distinguish the devout from the worldly. But either way, the message landed. Some monastic rules even warned against adorning the body, which could include trimming nails, cleaning ears, or yes, taming hair. The real fear was that grooming led to preening. Preening led to flirtation. And flirtation, well, you can fill in the rest. For priests sworn to celibacy, the slope was not just slippery, it was soaked in oil and lined with thorns. You sit on a warm bench near a convent gate now, watching a group of parishioners shuffle by. One old woman crosses herself at the sight of a priest with neat curls and a clean cloak. A whispered show-off floats by. Another man mutters that he must be sleeping somewhere warmer than the rest of us. Appearance, in this world, speaks volumes and not always kindly. Now, don't get it twisted. Vanity wasn't just frowned upon in clergy. It was seen as rebellion. Openly grooming could imply you thought yourself special separate from the suffering of the saints. And in a church where saints were often depicted emaciated, ragged, and joyless, being well put together felt suspiciously close to being sinful. There's an odd story tucked away in a 12th century chronicle about a village priest who owned not one, but 2 combs. One for everyday use, the other, brace yourself, for feast days. That second comb was rumored to be ivory. He was never officially punished, but he died mysteriously young. Some said fever. Others whispered divine judgment. You decide. Meanwhile, sermons became the medieval equivalent of subtweets. Preachers would rail against those who favor the curl over the cross, warning their flock that spiritual rot begins in the mirror. The congregation would nod gravely and glance sideways at Father Crispblocks in the front pew. Here's the paradox. Many of these same priests had to appear in public, officiate ceremonies, or serve in noble courts. They couldn't exactly show up looking like feral goats. So they walked a tightrope. Keep your hair neat enough to be respectable, but not so neat that anyone thinks you're enjoying it. And that's where the comb came in. It became both a tool and a trap. You needed it. You feared it. You might have wrapped it in linen, kept it in a hidden pocket, or borrowed one only after the candles were out. Some priests developed tricks. They'd finger comb their hair under their hoods, muttering prayers while pretending to itch. Others used a damp cloth to smooth curls without ever lifting a comb. Survival meant subtlety. There's a surviving account of a bishop who scolded a young deacon for using a finely carved comb before Mass. The deacon replied, "But I must not appear before the Lord in disarray." The bishop, deadpan, said, "The Lord does not measure your hair," which is hilarious, considering the number of saints who are famous because of their hair, or lack thereof. But we'll get to that. Of course, not everyone agreed. Some clergy defended grooming as a form of respect for the role, for the liturgy, for God himself. After all, if a king's envoy shows up looking like he slept in a ditch, no one takes the king seriously. Wasn't the same true for God's servants? But that defense didn't always hold up. The church was moving towards stricter reforms. Monastic movements like the Cistercians were championing poverty, self-denial, and visible discomfort. A well-groomed priest clashed with a growing pressure to look and live like a martyr. And this tension leaked into confessionals. Priests began asking not just about actions, but appearances. Have you spent undue time adorning yourself? Have you thought more about your hair than your prayers? For the medieval mind, thought itself was sin. A little grooming might just be the symptom of a soul in crisis. There's a fringe belief, no pun intended, that some priests even broke their combs into pieces before Lent as a symbolic gesture of humility. No one's found written proof, but it's the kind of pious overreaction that fits the mood perfectly. So imagine you're that priest again. Your head itches. Your hair's matted from a night in a drafty chamber. But you have morning mass in an hour, and the bishop might be watching. You lift the candle stub, reach beneath your robe, unwrap the comb. One swipe, two, you pause. Is that a footstep? You tuck it away again. A single hair clings to your wrist. You brush it off and breathe. The room smells of wax, ink, and a quiet, choking guilt. And you know, somewhere down the nave someone saw. You slip around the corner of the sacristy now, and the air feels heavier. There's a low hum from the cloisters, and the faint snip of scissors echoes somewhere deeper in the stonework. Welcome to the tonsure room, a strange little pocket of medieval, monastic life where hair met holiness in the most awkward of rituals. You blink in the dim light. A stool, a bowl, and a man with trembling hands holding a razor. That's your barber. Except here, he isn't called that. He's the tonsurator and assigned member of the clergy, or sometimes a monk, who had the unenviable job of shaping another man's path to God using a blade and a bowl. Forget gentle spa music or soothing towels. The tonsure process in the 12th century was about obedience, submission, public proof that you were shedding the world, one lock at a time. The classic monastic ring-style bald crown, fringe of hair around the sides, was meant to imitate the crown of thorns. Historians still argue whether this was actually biblical, or just the result of a very unfortunate haircut that got canonized. But either way, it stuck. For priests, monks, and even some bishops, your bald patch wasn't just regulation, it was a literal badge of holiness. And here's the fun part. The frequency of tonsuring wasn't exactly standardized. Some monasteries shaved heads every 2 weeks, others once a month, some only before major feasts. One overzealous abbot even insisted on weekly clippings, declaring that hair is the veil of pride. His monks probably loved him. But this was more than just upkeep. The moment of tonsure, especially the first time, was considered deeply symbolic. It was often done during a public ceremony, sometimes in front of the whole community. You'd kneel, bow your head, and let go of your vanity, one slow pass of the blade at a time. You feel the metal scrape your scalp now, not violently, but without tenderness. The cold air hits the raw skin. A few tufts fall to the floor. It's humbling, a little itchy, very awkward. Now imagine you're the one holding the blade. Monks turned barbers had to perform this ritual without slipping, nicking, or leaving too much fringe. There were real debates about how wide the tonsure circle should be. Some preferred a thin ring. Others argued for near complete baldness, claiming that only extreme visual humility could match Christ's sacrifice. In fact, these debates occasionally erupted into full-on clerical disputes, tonsure wars, if you will. It gets stranger. The style of your tonsure could reveal your religious allegiance. Celtic tonsures, for example, were often shaved front to back, while Roman ones favored the circular crown. During certain periods, this difference became a point of contention between monastic groups. Your scalp, quite literally, was a battleground of theology. And yes, sometimes the barbers rebelled, quietly. by shaping the fringe too thick or leaving a defiant curl untouched. One monastic letter accuses a tonsurator of deliberate laxity, which is possibly the medieval equivalent of giving someone sideburns just to see if anyone noticed. You hear a joke in the background. One monk to another. "Your tonsure's so crooked. I thought you were praying sideways." Monks weren't known for stand-up, but the burn lands. There's an apocryphal tale of a young cleric who secretly combed his fringe into a stylish little swoop after tonsure. He thought no one noticed, until one day during matins, the abbot reached over mid-prayer and plucked it right off. The story ends there, as many do, in scandal and silence. But let's take a moment for the real tragedy, the barber. Imagine being the guy tasked with walking the razor's edge literally and spiritually. Mess up, and the tonsure looks vain. Go too far, and you humiliate your brother. Do it right, and no one says a word. The stress was constant. The tools were crude. The lighting was awful. The scalp was often dirty. And yet, this simple, repeated act held incredible weight. Because hair was never just hair. It was theology, ego, punishment, purity. Every snip was a sermon. Some monasteries took it further. They'd assign younger monks to observe the tonsure process as part of their spiritual formation. The idea was, watch a man give up his beauty, and you'll learn to give up yours. No pressure. There's even evidence that a few abbots performed tonsure ceremonies while reading psalms aloud, so the sound of the scissors would be drowned out by sacred words. One poor soul described it as the sound of a lamb being sheared under thunderclouds. Dramatic? Sure. But this was a time when drama meant devotion. And sometimes it all went wrong. Barbers slipped. Scalps bled. One chronicler mentions a monk who fainted mid-tonsure from fasting and fell into the lap of the bishop, dragging the blade with him. The bishop was unharmed. The monk was reassigned. Another fringe tidbit. Monks sometimes used bits of beeswax to plaster the remaining hair flat, especially when it grew out unevenly. The result? A sticky, vaguely lemon-scented halo that bees occasionally mistook for home. You won't find that in most history books, but it happened. More than once. And so you sit in the tonsure room now, listening to the scrape of metal and the soft prayers muttered between clippings. The man before you rises, newly shorn, his face pale but peaceful. The next takes his place. No one speaks much. They all know what this is. A ritual, a performance, a sacrifice. In this room, the comb is absent on purpose, a symbol denied. Here, it's the blade that rules. And as you step back into the hallway, trailing hair dust from your cloak, you understand just how deeply the church feared the idea of self-presentation. The comb was vanity's tool, but the razor? That was God's. Your feet carry you quietly down the cloister, past the scent of lavender oil and smoldering wick. The walls whisper secrets, the kind no one writes down, but everyone hears. Ahead is a chamber not often discussed in sermons or scriptures, the priest's private quarters, small, dim, and sparse. But there, just there, tucked beneath a wooden washstand, is a polished bit of glass, a mirror. And you freeze. To a modern mind, mirrors are harmless, helpful, even a way to check for spinach in your teeth or part your hair the way your left side actually prefers. But here, in 12th century England, that shard of reflection is not a tool. It's a theological minefield. You step closer. It's small, circular, the kind merchants would have carried wrapped in cloth, often imported at great expense. Maybe it was left by a traveling canon. Or maybe a young priest keeps it hidden for those moments when his curiosity wins out. Either way, it's dangerous. Because within the walls of the church, mirrors weren't just frowned upon. They were treated with suspicion bordering on superstition. To look at yourself too closely was to look away from God. Scholars still debate whether priests truly believed mirrors could trap the soul, or whether that was just spiritual metaphor run wild. Either way, the suspicion stuck. A priest who lingers in front of a mirror is presumed to be seeking something beyond cleanliness, admiration, vanity, maybe even temptation. After all, if you start noticing your own cheekbones, what stops you from imagining someone else might too? Mirror gazing was often linked in sermons with lust. The implication was, if you're admiring yourself, you're already halfway to sin. One particularly grumpy abbot even called mirrors the devil's pond, claiming they reflected not the face, but the future fall of the beholder. Dramatic, sure, but it worked. Now think of the mirror's cousin, the comb. To use one often meant looking into the other. And that double act? That's what really unnerved the church. Grooming wasn't just about appearance. It required focus, attention, and reflection. And that reflection invited self-love, the wrong kind. You crouch by the washstand and peer into the mirror. It's warped, slightly greenish. The image it gives you is not flattering, but still, you stare. And in that stare, you realize something. It's not just your face staring back. It's your status, your position, your pride. Some clerics fought back against the superstition. They argued that caring for the body was a way of honoring God's creation. That awareness of one's appearance could be channeled into humility, not vanity. That a mirror, like any object, only reflected what the heart brought to it. But most bishops weren't interested in nuance. Many monasteries outright banned mirrors in private cells. In places where they were allowed, they were usually fixed to the wall and too high to stare into comfortably an architectural guilt trip. You weren't supposed to look at yourself. You were supposed to see your flaws. Imagine the irony. A man trained to guide souls who must never pause to see his own. There's a story passed down, probably exaggerated, of a priest who became obsessed with his mirror image. He combed his hair daily, even shaved his jaw with a sliver of metal, sharpened against stone. When confronted, he said, "The Lord made me beautiful. Why should I hide it?" He was stripped of his post within a week and reassigned to a leper colony in the north. The official reason? Spiritual misalignment. Even the architecture told you. Monastic cells were designed to keep focus outward toward God, the chapel, the heavens. A mirror turned the gaze inward, and that made the higher-ups nervous. You start to understand. It wasn't just about hair or grooming. It was about direction. Down the hall, a monk lights a candle. The flame flickers, and for a moment, you see your reflection again, this time in the brass plate he's polishing. That's how most clerics glimpse themselves, not by intention, but by accident. Reflection was meant to surprise, not seduce. And yet, comb use didn't stop. Mirrors still found their way into satchels and secret shelves. Humans are curious. Priests, for all their vows, were still human. And somewhere deep down, a desire to see oneself truly burned through the guilt. There's something else, too. Theological writings of the time often used the mirror as metaphor. Speculum animi, the mirror of the soul, was a common phrase in sermons. Priests were told to reflect inwardly, to examine their moral blemishes, to polish their hearts like metal. But how ironic that the physical act of doing just that was considered dangerous. It's almost poetic. You step back from the mirror now, careful not to smudge the glass. The room seems colder. The candle is burned low. Somewhere outside, a bell tolls. Sext, maybe. Time for prayers. You imagine priests like you, all across the countryside, scrubbing hands with ashes, bowing low, hair clumped or half-shaved or hidden under a cowl. Each one wondering, if only for a flicker, what they actually looked like. Because the church told them what to see: humility, sacrifice, obedience. But their combs and their mirrors whispered something else. Individuality, self-recognition, the treacherous seed of pride. And in that seed, the church saw a forest of trouble. So you extinguish the candle, close the wooden shutter over the mirror, and walk into the corridor, shadows stretching like long fingers behind you. No one saw you, but you saw yourself. And that, perhaps, is worse. You make your way out of the priest's quarters and into the crisp evening air. Somewhere in the distance, a flock of crows breaks from a yew tree, cawing like gossiping monks. The sky is dull slate, and the wind carries the smell of sheep, smoke, and something less savory clergy sweat, maybe. You pull your cloak tighter. It's going to get uncomfortable. Because tonight, you're going to meet a very unpopular type of priest. The clean one. Let's set the scene. Imagine a young cleric arriving at a new parish. His robes are tidy. His boots aren't caked in mud. His hair, oh scandal, is freshly washed and combed. Perhaps there's even a gentle wave to it, like he accidentally woke up looking poetic. Immediately, eyebrows lift. Someone clears their throat. A senior canon mutters something about too much time by the river. The subdeacon pretends to sneeze, but makes it sound suspiciously like vanitas. In the 12th century, a well-groomed priest didn't inspire admiration. He raised suspicion. The church had spent centuries trying to distinguish its priests from the wealthy laity and the nobility. Nobles wore perfume. Priests wore penitence. Nobles oiled their hair. Priests covered theirs with hoods and humility. So when a priest showed signs of self-care, the immediate assumption wasn't hygiene, it was corruption. People assumed you had a secret. Perhaps you were pocketing coins from offerings. Perhaps you were visiting merchants after hours. Perhaps, and this one always got whispers, you were trying to attract someone. It sounds ridiculous, but the fear was real. Appearance wasn't neutral. In a world where almost everything about your status was visible, how you looked said everything. Cleanliness, sadly, had consequences. Historians still debate just how widespread this attitude was, whether all priests were expected to look like weary shepherds, or whether this was more enforced in rural parishes than cathedral cities. But the trend is clear. Looking too good was the kind of spiritual red flag that made people start checking your Latin for signs of the devil. This leads us to one of the strangest paradoxes of the age. Personal grooming, a sign of discipline in modern eyes, was treated as indulgence. Priests weren't supposed to spend time on themselves. Their bodies were not their own. They were vessels. Public property. The cleaner you were, the more it looked like you'd spent time thinking about you. And yet, here's the kicker: priests still needed to look presentable. There were liturgical rules about vestments being clean. There were expectations for basic hygiene during sacraments. Nobody wanted to receive communion from someone who smelled like spoiled turnips. So what do? You walked a tightrope. You washed just enough. You brushed your teeth with mint sprigs or charcoal quietly. And if you combed your hair, you made sure no one saw you do it. There's a surviving parish account written in that tight, accusatory Latin that describes a priest being much too polished during a funeral. His tonsure was like a polished plate, and his beard softened with unknown ointments. The implication was clear. He had used oil, probably olive, possibly scented. The horror. The report also noted that several young women looked upon him with smiles. That was enough to spark an investigation. He was moved to a harsher post within the year. In this climate, a simple comb became incriminating. And you can't help but laugh a little. Not because it's silly, but because you know exactly how these things happen. One guy shows up looking better than the rest, and suddenly, everyone else feels exposed. They can smell their own unwashed hair. They notice their fraying cuffs. Resentment brews. And so does suspicion. Sometimes this suspicion turned into full-on ridicule. Priests who looked too courtly were nicknamed fratres delicati, the delicate brothers. Or worse, comati clerici heri clerics. It wasn't a compliment. It implied vanity, softness, weakness. And in a world where strength was measured in how much you could endure without flinching, being called soft was practically a curse. One chronicler tells of a bishop who refused to ordain a young priest on account of his smooth cheeks. When pressed, the bishop explained, "He looks like one who knows mirrors better than martyrs." Burn. But it wasn't just other priests. Parishioners joined in. Gossip in the alehouse. Snide remarks at the market. "Did you see Father Gregory's hair today? Must be fasting from humility." That kind of thing spread like lice in a monastery. And yet, people are complicated. Some secretly admired the well-groomed priests. A neat beard, a clean collar, a little style that caught attention. There are hints in letters and local complaints that such priests occasionally drew larger crowds. Not for the right reasons, perhaps, but crowds nonetheless, which led to even more tension. Was a priest drawing souls to God or to himself? So the church began doubling down. Homilies against vanity became more pointed. Bishops issued local decrees about grooming standards. Combs were mentioned by name in some monastic rules, objects to be shared, regulated, or limited. One particularly intense abbot even chained the community comb to a bench to discourage recreational use. That's right, they had a chain for a comb. And here's your quirky tidbit for the night. Some priests wore coarse linen caps over their tonsures to keep the hair flat and the temptation away. These caps were itchy, hot, and mildly absurd, but they served a purpose: deterrence. The less you thought about your hair, the less likely you were to sin. So, as you return to your cell for the evening, the candle sputtering low beside you, you sit on your narrow cot and think about the strange economy of cleanliness in the priesthood. Too dirty, and you risk offending your flock. Too clean, and you risk offending your God. A sweet spot? Just grimy enough to be credible. You glance at your comb, tucked beneath your blanket, and sigh. Maybe tomorrow. Maybe when no one's looking. And outside, the crows laugh again. Your fingers trail along the edge of your robe as you walk deeper into the chapel's sacristy, where the air is warmer, not from sunlight, but from secrets. Here, The walls are lined with vestments, candlesticks, and incense jars. But tonight, your eyes land on something tucked behind a chalice. A comb. Not just any comb either. Polished oak, engraved with a faint cross at the handle, its teeth worn smooth from use. You pick it up. It's heavier than you expect. Reverent, almost. You wouldn't be surprised if someone had kissed it once, as they might be a relic. But this object isn't treated like sacred treasure anymore. In fact, in many churches, it's feared. Why? Because in the 12th century, some people genuinely believed that combs were spiritually dangerous, not because of the material, but because of their symbolic power. They looked too much like tools of self-worship. And worse, they sometimes looked like relics. Let that sink in. You imagine a dusty chapel in Lincolnshire, where someone pulls out a carved ivory comb and places it gently beside a vial of holy oil and a bone, fragment labeled Sanctus Valentinus. It's not consecrated. It's not part of the Mass. And yet it sits there, revered by its owner, touched tenderly, passed from hand to hand like a saint's tooth. That made people uncomfortable. Historians still argue whether these combs were ever officially treated like relics, or whether they simply acquired a kind of personal sacredness among overly sentimental clergy. But something about the comb's presence, its connection to flesh, to ritual, to personal care blurred lines, the church wanted to keep sharp. You've probably guessed the irony. The church did have liturgical combs. There's even a tradition called the liturgical combing, where a bishop's hair would be ceremonially combed before Mass, usually on major feast days. The gesture symbolized purification, humility, and preparation. But here's the catch. That combing was done by someone else, never by the bishop himself. Because self-combing? That was indulgent. A bishop being combed, by contrast, was an image of submission. He was being served, like Christ before the Passion, whose feet were washed by others. This distinction, combing of versus combing, made all the difference. So when a priest owned a comb and used it privately, that wasn't sacred. It was selfish. The comb shifted from tool to temptation. And sometimes, it wasn't just frowned upon. It was demonized. You're sitting now in a dusty corner of a monastic library, thumbing through a psalter with marginal doodles, angels with trumpets, a cat chasing a mouse, a man holding a comb and being devoured by demons. Yes, really. Combs occasionally appear in these grotesque medieval illustrations as signs of vanity, often shown being wielded by devils or dangling temptingly from trees like forbidden fruit. The comb, in those moments, becomes a relic but of hell. One abbess reportedly claimed that combs could groom the devil's entry into the soul, a statement that would be hilarious if it hadn't led to confiscations. And confiscations did happen. You find records of combs being taken from young novices, their names recorded in scrawled Latin next to warnings about worldly inclinations. Some were told to confess their attachment to these items, as though the object itself had become their vice. Here's your fringe fact. One chronicler describes a ritual in which a confiscated comb was publicly broken, snapped in two, and placed at the foot of the altar as a symbol of spiritual defiance overcome. The imagery is wild. A bishop holding a comb aloft like a snake on a stick, snapping it, and the assembled monks nodding solemnly as if an exorcism had occurred. Of course, not all priests saw it this way. Some considered the fear of combs excessive, an overreaction born of zealotry and too many long winters. But once the comb took on this strange relic-like quality, It was hard to shake. Even the design didn't help. Many combs were elaborately carved. Some had scriptural inscriptions. Others bore tiny scenes, lions, vines, fish. One had a crude but unmistakable image of Christ's face on the handle, which historians still can't quite explain. Was it piety? Or was someone trying to sanctify their vanity? You chuckle softly to yourself. It's almost beautiful, this conflict. A mundane object transformed by context, twisted into sacredness, and then punished for it. You begin to wonder if any modern object carries that kind of contradiction. A fitness tracker, maybe. Holy discipline? Or obsessive self-love? Anyway, you tuck the comb back behind the chalice, careful not to leave fingerprints. Somewhere above you, a bell rings for Compline. The monks will be filing into the chapel soon, their feet dragging, their tonsures itching. Somewhere in that procession, you can be sure, at least one man carries a secret comb, hidden in his sleeve, or tucked into his shoe. He tells himself it's just practical. Maybe he even prays before using it. But in the eyes of the church, he's stroking pride. And in a place where the line between relic and rebellion is just a sliver of polished wood, that's more than enough to damn you. You rise before dawn, the cloister chilled and whisper quiet, the kind of silence that seems stitched into the stones themselves. Outside, mist clings to the grass, and the chapel bell hasn't yet dared to break the darkness. But inside the vestry, something is brewing, not incense, not prayer, but something far more combustible. Chatter. Because today is haircut day. You follow the rustle of robes down a narrow corridor toward the tonsure chamber. But today, it's not just monks being shaved. It's priests, deacons, subdeacons, the whole local clergy, gathered for what should be a simple ritual. Only it never is. Not really. As you enter, you see the barber already preparing his tools, dull razors, a bowl of water that's been warm once, and one dangerously splintered comb. The tension in the air crackles louder than the fire in the hearth. Because here's the truth. Whenever the clergy gathered for haircuts, they also gathered for something else. Gossip. And not the harmless kind. In a world without newspapers, without tavern jokes, and with sermons being your only public broadcast, a haircut became a rare social event. The church might discourage idle talk, but it had no way of stopping whispered jabs once the clippers came out. The barbershop became, unintentionally, a battleground of status. Did you hear about Brother Stephen's midnight visit to the bishop's quarters? One voice murmurs, his fringe is shorter than last time, trying to impress someone, perhaps. Even the way a man sat while being tonsured stiff, relaxed, eyes closed, or furtively scanning the room spoke volumes to the others. And don't think for a second the barber was just a barber. He was also an unofficial intelligence officer. He knew who had lice, who came in early to request a special cut, who grumbled when their fringe was trimmed too much. You can almost hear him filing mental notes between snips. Father Edwin has a boil. Brother Matthew flinched when I mentioned the bishop's sermon. Noted. Historians still argue whether these barbers were fully trusted clergy or just tolerated tradesmen. Some were monks. Others were laymen allowed inside sacred walls for this one service. But either way, they held strange power. And with that power came rumors. You watch now as a young priest lowers himself into the stool. He's new rosy cheeks, clean sleeves, hair a bit longer than protocol might allow. The barber raises an eyebrow, then gently runs the comb through the curls. Someone across the room clears their throat pointedly. Trying to look like a troubadour? Someone whispers just loud enough. The young man blushes. The barber keeps combing. That comb, by the way, isn't special. It's shared, chipped, and cleaned maybe once a month. But in this moment, it becomes a weapon. A prop in the public theater of status. The longer the combing takes, the more indulgent it seems. Some barbers purposely rushed the men they didn't like. A few pulled at the scalp more than necessary. And when the combing was too gentle, well, that raised eyebrows too. There's a record of a particularly ambitious deacon in Yorkshire who always insisted his tonsure be rounded with care. He even had a habit of nodding at his own reflection in the brass of a nearby candlestick. One day, the barber nicked him, just a little. The rumor spread before Cumberland. He's marked now. The Lord disapproves. This might sound petty. It was. But in a world where your appearance could determine your next appointment, your reputation mattered. And the comb? That humble strip of horn or wood? It became the center of an unspoken hierarchy. Some clergy requested different combs, finer teeth, wider teeth. One even brought his own, only to have it confiscated with a note reading, "Excessive care signals excessive pride." Even the sound of the comb scraping against a dry scalp became part of the atmosphere. In some monasteries, men were told not to speak at all during tonsure, but they still listened. Every little sound, a nick, a sigh, a snap of a tooth from the comb. These were social cues. You sit back now, watching this all unfold. One priest is done. He rises, bows slightly. Another takes his place. He winces. Someone chuckles. The gossip mutters on. A fraternal joke, they say, but underneath is judgment. Real, pointed judgment. And just when you think it can't get more theatrical, the abbey's prior enters. Everyone stiffens. The barber nods solemnly and offers him the comb like a relic. The room quiets. The comb glides once, twice. A wisp of hair falls. And that's when someone whispers too loud. "Careful, prior. That fringe is starting to look symmetrical." A beat, laughter, then a tight smile from the prior. He leaves without a word. This is how the game is played. And here's your quirky historical tidbit. Some monks wrote sarcastic poetry about these sessions. Light verse about vanity under the razor, about brother combs a lot, and about barbers who thought they wielded power second only to God. One surviving poem ends with the line, "Better a crooked tonsure than a crooked soul," though neither's much to look at. You stretch your legs now and follow the last priest out of the chamber. The air outside smells sweeter, less sweaty, less judgmental. But you know, as they all do, that the real reason clergy hated combs wasn't just because of vanity. It was because of visibility. A comb put your grooming into public view. And once something could be seen, it could be judged, mocked, twisted. A blade may draw blood, but a comb, it draws conclusions. And that on some days hurts more. You make your way back through the cloister after the spectacle of the tonsure chamber, brushing past the scent of damp wool and cold ash. The light is shifting, softening into that peculiar medieval gray that never quite becomes daylight. And just ahead, in the sacristy, a flickering lamp glows gold on a row of tiny glass flasks. You step inside. These are the church's oil's sacred stuff. Chrism, for baptism and confirmation. Oil of the sick. Oil of the catechumens. Each one carefully poured, labeled, and guarded with more care than wine or bread. You feel a twinge of reverence just looking at them, and then your nose twitches. One of these oils smells surprisingly good, floral even, almost pleasant. You sniff again. It's not incense, it's hair oil. Oh no, because now you've entered the sticky, slippery debate that no one wants to admit existed in the 12th century English church. The secret war between holy oils and hair products. Let's be clear, priests were expected to use oils for sacramental purposes. Anointing the sick, blessing the baptized, rubbing the forehead of the dying. But when oils started making their way into the priest's hair, that was another story entirely. You glance at the altar boy, wiping down a chalice with suspiciously shiny fingers. His scalp glistens just a little in the lamplight. Is it sweat or something else? In some parts of England, oils derived from bay, rosemary, or even pressed animal fat were used as basic grooming aids. Not just for shine, but to keep the hair flat under a hood, or to prevent the scalp from cracking in cold weather. Practical, reasonable. But in the eyes of some church leaders, slippery slopes were always oiled. Historians still argue whether these priests were truly trying to look fancy, or just preserve their skin in freezing stone buildings. But the perception stuck. Oily hair meant vain hair, and vain hair meant a compromised soul. Worse still, it was hard to tell what kind of oil you were using. Holy oil didn't smell like sandalwood. The subtle hint of lavender, that came from the apothecary, not the apps. So when a priest walked into the chapel, glistening a little too much, the whispers began. Is that chrism or clove? You see how messy it gets. Quite literally. This is when the church found itself caught in its own logic. Priests were encouraged to abstain from luxury, but they were also expected to look, well, alive. Cracked lips, scabbed scalps, dry hands. These things distracted the congregation, especially during sacraments. A face that looked like it had survived a sandstorm wasn't exactly spiritually uplifting. So what do? Moisturize in secret. You watch as one monk dips a cloth into oil and gently pats the top of his head under his cowl. Just once. Quick, like he's hiding contraband. Which, depending on who's watching, he kind of is. There were, believe it or not, actual recorded sermons against gleaming scalps and perfumed follicles. One preacher warned that those who smell of garden oils risk drawing the nose of Satan himself. It's unclear if he meant that literally, but the image is spectacular. Satan sniffing out sin like a bloodhound. Even anointing rituals started raising questions. Was the priest rubbing the chrism into the forehead of a child, or using the excess to soften his own temples afterward? You'd think no one would be that bold, but there are vague accusations in church correspondence that hint it may have happened. Here's your quirky historical tidbit. One monastic rule, probably written in frustration, simply states, let the oils remain for the Lord and not for the scalp. Direct, to the point. But the truth is, the lines kept blurring. Grooming oils were sometimes sold by the same apothecaries that supplied religious oils. Bottles looked alike, scents overlapped. A priest could easily accidentally use a secular oil and claim it was just a mislabeling. And then came the nobles. Wealthy patrons often donated scented oils to their local churches, intended for the altar, supposedly. But guess who also used those same oils in their beards, their cloaks, their boots? Yep, the line between gift and grooming aid started dissolving like wax in sun. Some ambitious clergy saw opportunity, used the oil, smell refined, impressed the bishop. One priest in a court-adjacent chapel reportedly combed rosemary oil through his fringe before high feast days, so the spirit might flow more freely, he said. He was reassigned within the month. This is where the comb returns, because a dry comb is simple, humble, but dip that comb in oil, you've entered the realm of choices. And choices, in the medieval church, had consequences. Some abbots banned oils entirely outside the sacristy. Others required oil logs, yes, actual written logs, tracking who used what and when. The implication being, we're watching your shine, brother. The most dramatic measure? One priory reportedly held a public inspection during Lent, checking the heads of its clergy for unauthorized gleam. You picture it now. A somber monk running his fingers across a scalp, squinting and announcing, "Brother Elric, explain this." But perhaps the best image of all is this: a priest kneeling in prayer, forehead bowed, tonsure gleaming faintly in the candlelight. To some, he's a beacon of purity. To others, he's a warning sign, because in 12th century England, the oil on your head might just say more about your soul than the prayers on your lips. And as you walk away from the vestry now, the scent of bay and myrrh trailing faintly behind, you wonder, if cleanliness is next to godliness, why does it so often get you in trouble? The bells toll again deep, slow, echoing over the fields like the heartbeat of something ancient and mildly disapproving. You're walking now beneath the towering eaves of a cathedral, the kind of place that swallows sound and makes even confident footsteps feel like they're trespassing. Inside, a council is underway. Not a royal one, no velvet cloaks or jeweled rings. This is a church council, and the men gathered here, bishops, abbots, priors, are arguing about something very, very serious. Hair. More specifically, how long it should be. You stifle a laugh, but they are deadly serious. You find a corner and settle in quietly as the discussion unfolds. Latin phrases whip through the air like sharp gusts decens tonsura. Ordinata corona, formam clericum. You don't need to be fluent to catch the meaning. They're debating standards. Not theology, not heresy, not doctrine, but bangs, fringes, the circumference of a sacred bald spot. It might sound absurd, but this is deadly serious to them, because the 12th century was a time of tightening control, when the church was actively trying to regulate its appearance, its structure, and most of all, its identity. And what's more visible than a man's hair? One bishop pounds the table and demands that all priests maintain a tonsure, the size of the host, meaning the Eucharistic bread. Another argues it should be not smaller than a dove's wingspan. You hope that's metaphorical, but honestly, you're not sure. Historians still argue whether these hair length disputes were grounded in genuine spiritual concerns or simply ecclesiastical one-upmanship. The church was trying to distance itself from the secular world and from internal factions that were growing a little too fond of personal flair. And so, the hair became a battlefield. Some dioceses issued actual measurements. Rules about how far the fringe may fall past the ear. Diagrams were sketched. Notepads filled. This was an administrative drama at its finest. In one documented case, a bishop from York declared that no cleric may appear with hair that casts shadow upon the eyelid. Bold, poetic, utterly unenforceable. And here's the real kicker. These debates often had nothing to do with the lay people. Parishioners couldn't care less if their priest had a slightly generous halo of hair. But other clergy? Oh, they cared. Because hair length became a proxy for obedience. A visual shorthand for whether a man was taking his vows seriously or subtly rebelling. And rebellion came in tufts. You look around the council chamber and notice it now. Most of the older men have harsh, narrow tonsures. Pale bald patches, fringes cut so tight it looks like someone used a bowl and a thread. But the younger ones? Some have allowed a little flair. A wave at the temples. A combed down swoop. That's all it takes to cause a stir. There's even a bishop across the room, glaring at a deacon's curls, as if they might leap from his head and form their own heresy. And here's your fringe fact. Some monks actually boasted about their tight tonsures, claiming it made them less likely to be touched by temptation. One even said his head was so barren, not even Satan could plant seed there. A bold claim, considering Satan's persistence. You lean in now as the argument heats up. One abbot says, if a man may shape his fringe, he shapes his soul in pride. Another counters, our Lord had hair. Shall we be more bald than Christ himself? A few heads turn at that one. It's a valid point. Images of Christ always depict him with flowing hair. So how did short, scrubbed scalps become the symbol of spiritual strength? The answer lies in contrast. Christ may have had hair, but he also had wounds, humility, and poverty. To be clean-cut in a medieval monastery implied you were worried about the wrong kind of image. There's a joke floating around some monasteries that goes, what do vanity and lice have in common? Both begin on the fringe and end in confession. Not funny, not original, but accurate. You turn your attention to a side table where some notes are being passed between scribes. One reads, Father Thomas now trims his fringe twice weekly. Suspect motives. Another simply, a new comb spotted. Dark wood, possibly purchased from the marketplace. This is not about grooming. It's surveillance. At the heart of all this, of course, is fear. Fear that the clergy will become indistinguishable from the laity, that the sacred will blend with the secular, that pride will sneak in not through doctrine, but through a curl of hair. And the church, to its credit, or perhaps its panic responds with rules. The council votes. A new decree passes. No fringe shall exceed the width of 2 fingers beyond the tonsure. A scribe scribbles furiously. The bishop who proposed it nods solemnly, like he's saved the church from something unholy, and the room breathes. You feel a strange tension lift, the kind of relief that comes from putting something ridiculous to rest, even if only for a while. But as you file out behind the others, you can't help but notice one young priest lagging behind. He pulls out a comb, quickly runs it through his fringe, checks a piece of polished metal for symmetry, then tucks the comb away and glances around. He saw the vote. He knows the rule. And yet, some rebellions are soft, quiet, personal. And in a church constantly redefining what it means to be holy, sometimes a little hair is all it takes to declare, I'm still me. Evening again. The sun dips low over the marshes, casting long gold streaks across the stone walls of the priory. You walk in silence beside a line of weary monks, their footsteps soft in the dew. No words are exchanged, but you can feel it's something simmering just beneath the surface. You follow them into the refectory, where a dull hush hangs like wool in the air. The kind of silence that tastes of old bread, boiled turnips, and something a little spicier, jealousy. Yes, tonight, you're stepping into one of the church's quieter scandals, tonsure envy. You never thought monks could be petty about baldness, but oh, they could. And they were. The tonsure, you recall, was supposed to symbolize humility, an open crown, a circle of shame made holy. But when you're surrounded by men who also have exposed skulls, some begin to notice whose hair grows back slower, whose scalp stays patchy, whose fringe is just a little too full for someone claiming spiritual detachment. And that's when things get snide. You take your seat on a creaky bench and listen to the faintest cough from 2 seats down. It's not just a cough. It's a signal. A monk with a wide tonsure leans to another and whispers, "Brother Elric's halo is shrinking." A pause. He says it's divine favor. I say it's clove oil. The other snorts. The conversation ends, but the message lingers. Because in some circles, losing hair was a sign of divine discipline, God's way of carving his mark directly into the skull. And in others, it was seen as punishment. The fringe debates we saw earlier, they've settled here, under the skin. Now, every inch of hair is loaded with meaning. Historians still argue whether monastic communities actively measured and compared tonsure sizes, or if this was just a product of whispered politics. But surviving letters and journals are full of subtle jabs. Brother Julian writes of Brother Cedric's creeping curls and says, "One cannot help but wonder if his prayers are as full as his fringe." Yikes. You walk past the washroom later and catch sight of one young monk rubbing a stone across his crown, not to clean, but to irritate, to keep the hair from growing, to hold the shape of holiness just a bit longer. His eyes are tight, determined, perhaps a little desperate. You want to stop him. You don't. You just listen to the scratch of stone on skin and wonder how devotion turned into self-harm. It's not always so bleak, though. Sometimes the envy played out in humor. One old monk, practically gleaming with baldness, was known for announcing before Compline, "If my head gets any holier, I shall start floating." His friends would chuckle, tap their own uneven tonsures, and for a moment, it felt more like family than competition. But the whispers always returned. Sometimes the jealousy wasn't about baldness, but about the hair that remained. A particularly thick fringe might spark accusations of vanity, or rumors that someone was combing when they shouldn't, or worse, oiling. One monk was reportedly asked to show his comb to the abbot. He didn't have one. He never had one. But the suspicion stuck. People noticed his neat fringe and began calling him Brother Peony, after the delicate flowers that bloom too perfectly to be trusted. And here's your quirky tidbit. In some monasteries, older monks accused younger ones of warming their scalps with cloth to prevent irritation from shaving. This was seen as cheating. If your tonsure didn't itch, you weren't suffering enough. A few monks even suggested leaving scalp wounds unbandaged to show devotion. Medieval skincare? Not so much. You hear someone call out softly behind you. It's Brother Ethelwyn, a man whose tonsure is jagged at best, like a chunk was taken out with a spoon. He smiles as he passes. "Not all crowns are easy to carry," he says. You nod. Because here's the deeper truth. The tonsure was never really about hair. It was about the tension between hiding and revealing. About the parts of yourself you're expected to expose for the sake of others. And that makes it ripe for envy. Some monks saw the bald crown as a burden, others as a badge. Some hid it under hoods. Others flaunted it like a battle scar. And some stared at their brothers' scalps, not with scorn, but longing. longing for the clarity of belief, longing for the conviction that you were marked, chosen, that your suffering had meaning, that your patchy hairline was proof of divine love. Historians rarely write about that part. They talk about combs and councils, canons and contradictions, but they don't always catch the quiet glances, the small insults, the ritual that becomes identity, and then insecurity. You make your way to your cell that night, the moonlight catching on every exposed head as the monks disperse. One man scratches at his scalp, another smooths his fringe with a wet palm, and another sits still, his tonsure neat but fading. The lights dim, silence returns, and in that stillness, you remember something a novice once whispered during his first tonsure, voice shaking. What if my hair never grows back the same? No one answered him, because it never does. It's midnight now. The priory is still, save for the creak of wood and the sigh of sleeping bodies. You wander the hallway softly, your steps muffled by the war wool of your slippers. And just beyond the vestry door, past a stack of tithing records and a half-eaten crust of bread, lies a curious little item tucked into a satchel. A comb, but not the kind you've seen before. This one is black, jet black, smooth as glass, carved from bone, or maybe a rare piece of polished horn. The kind of object that doesn't just part hair, it whispers status. And it belongs to someone who really shouldn't have it, because you've entered the secret world of rogue priests, the ones who knew the rules, preached the rules, wore the rules, but broke them when no one was watching. The black comb is a symbol, a quiet declaration, a line in the tantra-sanded sand. You pick it up, and it feels deliberate crafted, elegant. Not the rough wooden communal comb chained to a bench. This is private property, personal luxury, maybe even imported. Historians still debate whether black combs like this were truly tokens of defiance or simply coveted heirlooms. But there's no doubt they became associated with a certain kind of priest, the ones who blurred the lines between service and self-indulgence. And these men existed, always had. You close your eyes and picture one now. A young cleric with neatly parted hair, slipping into a chapel at dusk to recite the office alone, voice soft, hands clean, comb hidden beneath his alb. He believes in God. He also believes in looking good while serving him. That doesn't go unnoticed. These priests developed reputations, sometimes whispered admiringly, sometimes spit out with disgust. He preaches like Peter, someone might say, but dresses like a troubadour. Others might lower their voices and add, he carries a black comb. It became a kind of code. Not everyone who owned one was a rebel, of course, but it marked you. And in a church obsessed with external symbols of internal purity, owning an object like this was like carrying a dagger with a velvet handle, subtle, but undeniably sharp. You leaf through a stack of old parchment in the vestry and find a report from a bishop's assistant. Father Allen of Cricklade, found with a private comb, dark wood. Claims it was inherited, denies polishing it, possible secular influence. Observe further. There's no record of what happened to Father Allen. Maybe he was demoted. Maybe he was moved to a colder parish with worse bread. Maybe nothing happened at all, because the comb in itself wasn't banned, just provocative. That's what made it dangerous. Church doctrine in the 12th century was rarely black and white. More often, it lived in suspicion and social pressure. There were no canon laws that said, "Thou shalt not carry a handsome comb." But if you did, people started watching. waiting. One too many combings. One too many unusually crisp fringes. Suddenly, you're being called to speak with the bishop. Not about doctrine, about discipline. You run your finger along the comb's edge. It's cool. Well kept. This priest cared for it. Probably kept it wrapped in cloth. Maybe he even said a little prayer before using it something ironic like Domini, dona mihi ordinum capillora. Lord, grant me orderly hair. And here's your quirky tidbit for the night. Some rogue priests were said to anoint their combs. Just a dab of oil or scented balm to soothe the teeth, they said. One was caught using rose water. The scandal was less about the fragrance and more about the idea that a tool of vanity was being treated with reverence. It's easy to think of these men as vain, but many were also brilliant preachers, devoted confessors, excellent administrators. The church needed them, but it also feared them, because they reminded everyone that holiness, when paired with charm, could become magnetic. One rogue priest in Cornwall was rumored to have drawn noble women to Mass in record numbers. When asked why, one woman reportedly said, "Because he speaks like an angel and smells like one too." He was reassigned to a coastal outpost 2 months later. You tuck the comb back into the satchel, gently, and step away. The room is quiet. The moonlight spills through the window, and you begin to understand what the church truly feared about combs like this. It wasn't the object, it was the choice. The personal choice to carry something unnecessary, to maintain an identity separate from the institution. Because when a priest owns a black comb, he's saying, I still belong to myself. And in a world where every part of you, your bed, your prayers, your hair, was meant to be surrendered to God, that was a scandal in miniature. You make your way down the dark corridor now, passing sleeping figures wrapped in wool. Someone shifts in their cot. Someone snores. But one, somewhere, lies awake, his black comb wrapped carefully under his pillow, not defying the church. Not exactly, just refusing to disappear. The morning begins like any other bells, bread, and cold hands fumbling through vestments. But today there's a hum in the air, something tense and twitching beneath the surface. You notice it in the way the priests walk, chins high, hair hidden under tighter hoods than usual. And then you hear it sharp, loud, unmistakable. A sermon, not just any sermon. A comb sermon. You take a seat near the back of the nave. The preacher, an older man with a weathered face and a tonsure so wide it could double as a target grips. The pulpit like it's the last upright thing in the world. His voice, despite its age, is iron. Brethren, he booms, how clean is your soul? When your hair is cleaner still, the congregation flinches. You've stumbled into one of the most pointed rituals of public rebuke in the medieval church, the anti-vanity sermon. And the star of today's performance? That ancient villain, the humble comb. You sit quietly as the preacher paces, building steam. We are not knights. We are not actors. We are not lovers in the court of sin. We are men of God, crowned by his mercy, not by the luster of hair oil and sly glances in polished bronze. A few heads lower, one young deacon shifts awkwardly. You recognize him from the vestry. He's the one with the suspiciously tidy fringe. The preacher's tone sharpens. There are those among us, yes, among us who slip combs into their sleeves, not for lice, but for pride. They tame not beasts, but their own vanities. They polish what God has asked us to surrender. The words land like a whip, and the room goes still. Historians still argue whether these sermons were about actual behavior or more about control, whether the priests really were flaunting themselves, or whether the church just needed to remind everyone who held the mirror. But there's no denying their drama. One record from Lincoln details a monk who was made to sit near the pulpit during such a sermon silent, head bowed, his confiscated comb displayed on the altar like a cursed artifact. That didn't happen today. But you wouldn't be surprised if it did tomorrow. You glance around. Some faces are unreadable. Others burn with embarrassment. A few smirk behind their sleeves, as if to say, yes, I still have my comb. And no, I'm not giving it up. The sermon continues. Does the Holy Spirit come faster to a man who parts his hair with symmetry? The preacher growls. Does Christ look upon your fringe and say, this one I love more? No, the only adornment a priest should wear is the weight of his duty. You almost clap, but the best lines are still to come. Vanity, he says, pausing for effect, is the devil's mirror, and the comb? It is the handle. Boom. There it is. You can't help but admire the phrasing. Medieval preachers were artists, and sermons like these weren't just rants. They were performances. Metaphors sharpened to swords. Pacing like liturgy. If you didn't come out of one feeling bruised, you probably weren't listening. But here's the strange twist. These sermons also created legends. The more the church attacked grooming habits, the more mythic those habits became. Priests with combs were whispered about, feared, admired, like stylish outlaws. The sermons that condemned them also gave them stage time. You lean over now to your neighbor, a friar with thick eyebrows and no visible fringe, and whisper, "Is this really about combs?" He shrugs. It's always about control, because the church wasn't just guarding theology. It was a guarding image. Every clean line, every neat fold, every combed curl could be read as subversion. Not heretical, but slippery. And that was worse. Heresy you could burn. Pride you had to chase. Here's your quirky detail for tonight. Some churches actually kept a broken comb in the sacristy as a symbol of purity. A display. A warning. The story goes that it belonged to a priest who renounced vanity mid-sermon and shattered his comb on the altar. Whether true or invented, it became lore. The fragments were treated with more reverence than the man himself. You stand now as the preacher begins to close. His voice softens, slows. I do not say these things to shame, he says, but to remind, we are vessels. We do not shine by polish, but by purpose. If your fringe hides your forehead, then perhaps it hides your faith. You shiver. That one hit home. And then silence. A long, sacred silence, as if the walls themselves are waiting to see who fidgets first. Eventually, movement returns. The congregation begins to shuffle. No one speaks loudly. A few nods. One man discreetly tugs his hood down further over his scalp. Another rubs his head with a sleeve, as if to mess up his hair deliberately. And the young deacon with the tidy fringe? He lingers a little too long. His jaw clenches. You see his hand twitch toward his pocket, but he stops. Not today. You step outside into the bright morning sun, blinking, your ears still ringing with the sermon's fire. And as you walk through the cloister garden, petals brushing your sleeves, you think about how a tool as ordinary as a comb could stir so much fear. But then again, anything that draws the eye might draw the soul, and that, to the medieval mind, was always a risk. The breeze is stiff this afternoon, rattling the chapel windows and tugging the laundry lines strung between stone outbuildings. You follow the sound of murmured voices toward the village square, where the market stalls have been cleared for something more theatrical. A display. Not produce, not relics, not even bones, but combs, broken ones, laid out on a long plank like defeated soldiers. You stop at the edge of the crowd and take it in. A humble outdoor sermon space hastily converted into a public courtroom of sorts. And today's trial? Vanity, once again. Because you've arrived just in time for a comb confiscation. A spectacle both rare and unforgettable. In front of the gathered villagers and clerics, a priest stands solemnly beside a wooden box. Inside it, confiscated combs, collected over months from monastic cells, parsonage drawers, and even one overly flamboyant chore boy's travel kit. The box is opened with a ceremony. Each comb is held up slowly, dramatically for all to see. Some are simple, bone, wood, dull. Others are far more dangerous looking. Carved horn, delicate etchings, even one with what appears to be a faint inlay of mother of pearl. That one gets a gasp, and then snap, the comb is broken in half. One piece placed in the fire, the other left on the altar stone as a warning. It's as if they're exercising pride. The presiding abbot steps forward and announces, "These are tools of distraction, instruments of the flesh. Let no man say he was not warned." A smattering of murmured amens. A woman in the back whispers something about Brother Jonan's hair being too perfect anyway. A boy giggles and is promptly silenced. This kind of public rebuke wasn't everyday practice, but it happened often enough to earn a place in clerical folklore. And historians still debate whether these events were meant for punishment or pure propaganda. One theory suggests they were a reaction to rising tensions between rural clergy and wealthier urban clerics who'd begun drifting a little too close to secular fashion. Whatever the motive, it made an impression. Priests who watched their own combs snapped in half were said to feel a peculiar kind of grief, not for the object itself, but for what it represented: privacy, selfhood, maybe even the comfort of order in a life of chaos. And sometimes it wasn't just combs that were taken. One document, Frayed and Fade, describes a rural curate caught with a small polished mirror and a bottle of clove oil. The bishop ordered a public burning of the items, during which the man was required to recite the Miserere, Psalm 51 barefoot. For added flair, he had to drop the items into the fire himself. Brutal, but effective. Because the real goal was humiliation. And here's your quirky tidbit. In some parishes, confiscated combs were nailed to the inside of the vestry door-like trophies. A silent wall of shame, where young priests were told, "Better your pride be pried from your pocket than from your soul." You walk along the edge of the crowd now, watching expressions shift. Some are smug, others are curious. One or two seem genuinely afraid. And then you spot him a priest, probably no older than 30, sleeves damp with nervous sweat. He's next in line. A deacon steps forward with his satchel, reaches in, pulls out a slim, dark comb. Simple, but personal. The priest doesn't protest, just closes his eyes. The comb is lifted, displayed, snapped in two. His fingers twitch, just once. No punishment is given. Not out loud, but everyone sees. Everyone knows. You imagine what happens after. The awkward silence in the dormitory. The absence of clicks and smooth strokes before morning prayers. A head that feels messier than usual, but not from sleep. In this way, combs became markers of obedience. If you handed yours over willingly, you were devout. If it had to be found, you were something else. Still, not all confiscations were so orderly. There are records scattered, half believable, of priests hiding combs in candle boxes, behind altar cloths, even carved into the spines of psalters. One particularly ingenious cleric supposedly fashioned his comb into the hinge of his prayer book. He was caught only when it fell out during a sermon. What happened next? Public shaming, of course, possibly followed by reassignment to a colder, wetter village, where even thinking about hair was considered indulgence. As the crowd begins to disperse, you linger. The plank is empty now. Only splinters remain. But you see what's really left behind: fear, guilt, and the unspoken question, who's next? Because once the church declares something dangerous, it rarely forgets. And the comb, once just a daily tool, now sits firmly in the realm of suspicion. Not because it harms, but because it tempts. You take one last glance at the splinters in the grass. A breeze picks up, carrying the faint scent of ash and scorched pride. And in that scent is a lesson. In 12th century England, you didn't have to sin to be punished. You just had to own something beautiful. The hills beyond the monastery roll gently under the weight of dusk, and you follow a winding path away from the cloisters, away from bells, sermons, and the snapping of combs. The air here is softer. Wildflowers bend lazily in the wind, and even the sheep seem quieter, like they've overheard too many confessions and grown politely tired of them. You walk toward a small cottage nestled beside a crumbling Roman wall. Smoke curls from its chimney. A curious mix of herbs, ink, and rain-washed wool clings to the breeze. This is where the whisperers live now. Not witches, not rebels, but suspected heretics. And their grooming habits, oddly enough, have caught the church's attention. You step inside. Low ceiling, books, a single candle burning on a wooden desk, and there, beside a stack of parchment, another comb. Black, long-toothed, untouched by shame. Because in the later 12th century, the church's growing fear of heresy didn't just target ideas. It targeted appearances, practices, habits. And a man who carried a comb, especially the wrong kind, was suddenly more than vain. He was suspect. Historians still debate the role of grooming in early heresy trials. No canon law condemned combs outright, but inquisitors, bishops, and self-appointed moral guardians began to associate certain looks with rebellion. The Cathars, for example, those shadowy figures haunting the southern regions, were rumored to practice asceticism with style. Clean robes, calm voices, and yes, neatly parted hair. Because cleanliness, when paired with confidence, could signal conviction, and the church couldn't stand that. So the comb, once merely suspicious, became criminal adjacent. A priest caught combing too carefully might find himself accused not just of vanity, but of alignment. Why so tidy, Father? They might ask. Whose theology are you grooming for? You sit across from the cottage's resident, a priest, stripped of his title years ago. His hands are ink-stained. His tonsure has grown out, and yet his hair is smooth, combed, not proudly, just peacefully. He smiles faintly. They said I loved the mirror more than the host. You don't need to ask if it was true, because it didn't matter. By then, the accusation had stuck. He looked different, too composed, too quiet. And the church, already nervous about dissenters, decided it was safer to cast him out. There are notes in the bishop's register about cases like his. Phrases like, "a priest of suspect appearance," or "carried items unbecoming of clerical simplicity." The items usually meant books, sometimes jewelry, but often enough, it meant grooming tools. Even Inquisition manuals, though rarely focused on personal hygiene, warned that certain signs of orderliness, when paired with soft-spoken obstinacy, might signal defiance. Here's your fringe fact for tonight. One inquisitor reportedly brought a comb to trial as evidence. He claimed it belonged to a cleric who had abandoned Rome in the grooming of his conscience. The phrase was mocked later by poets. But the comb was burned anyway. You leaf through a book on the cottage desk and find the passage underlined in faded ink. It's from Augustine. "Let not thy attention fall upon the flesh, but the spirit, for the mirror shows only what is passing." A warning, but also maybe a lament. The man across from you sees your gaze. "We all comb our thoughts," he says softly. "The church just didn't like when I combed mine into order." Outside, the wind picks up. He shows you his last possession from before his trial. Not a relic, not a chalice, just the comb, wrapped in cloth, clean. The wood still smells faintly of cedar. He doesn't use it anymore, not out of shame, but out of preservation. "It reminds me," he says, "that I am not broken." And that's the real fear, isn't it? The church, in the 12th century, didn't just fear sin. It feared autonomy. The idea that a man could shape himself body, soul, hairline, without needing every gesture approved. The comb, small as it was, became a symbol of unapproved agency. Not rebellion, just the ability to define oneself. And that's what made it dangerous. You leave the cottage as the candle burns lower. The air is cooler now. The stars blink slowly awake. And you realize something as your fingers brush your own scalp. The line between heretic and holy man was never drawn with blood or belief. Sometimes it was drawn with a comb. Because the moment the church began looking at outward appearance as evidence of inner disobedience, even neatness became suspect. And the black comb? That small piece of shaped bone? It became, in some corners, a badge of quiet resistance. Not flashy, not loud, just present. And very hard to forget. The mist hangs heavy as you follow a winding corridor inside the cathedral cloister, footsteps echoing like a memory. Somewhere far above, pigeons mutter in the rafters. Your fingers trail across cool stone as you descend a stairwell few ever use, spiraling into the cold guts of the priory. Down here, the air smells like mold, ink, and silence. No footsteps, no voices, just the hush of old secrets. You step into a narrow chamber, barely lit by the daylight, filtering through a grated window. Wooden shelves sag under the weight of forgotten vestments, water-stained hymnals, and boxes full of unneeded things the church didn't ban, but didn't trust either. And under one shelf, half wrapped in linen, is a comb, the last comb in Canterbury. You kneel, hands steady, heart a little too loud in your ears. It's simple, carved from bone, yellowed with age, the teeth uneven where someone's fingernail once scraped it too hard. But it's intact, whole, unsnapped. This isn't a relic, not exactly. But it might as well be, because this comb, this forgotten, dusty little item sits at the quiet center of a long, strange battle between order and obedience, between spiritual discipline and human dignity. Who left it here? No one knows. Maybe a monk who couldn't bring himself to burn it. Maybe a priest who carried it for years in secret, then buried it like contraband beneath the floorboards of his soul. Maybe someone who didn't believe the comb was dangerous, but knew others did. You hold it carefully. It weighs less than a prayer, but somehow feels heavier than any sermon. You remember everything now: the sermons, the counsels, the confiscations, the whispered envy over hair that grew too well, the fear that a clean fringe might mean a messy heart, the angry abbots and the rebel priests, the broken combs held up like exorcised demons. And now, here it is, whole, untouched, waiting. Historians still argue whether the combs were ever truly banned, whether the hatred was literal or symbolic. But you know this much: when people fear an object, it's never really about the object. It's about what it represents. This comb represents privacy, vanity, rebellion, but I also care. Ritual, a small, quiet reminder that even men of God are still made of skin and scalp and the ache to feel human. You set it down gently and sit on the stone floor, letting the silence hold you. Above, life continues. Priests chant, monks kneel. Someone delivers bread. But down here, where the air is still and the stories go to sleep, a single comb endures, not to defy, not to tempt, just to remember. Because the church may have hated combs, but I never forgot them, and neither will you. And now, as the candle burns low and the shadows soften into gentle curves, you let yourself settle. The stone walls feel less cold now, less imposing. They don't press in, they hold you, like the silence of a chapel after Vespers, when no one speaks, but everything still listens. You draw a long breath, slow and quiet, and let your thoughts drift gently back over the path you've walked. You've followed the thread of something small, a comb, and discovered a world hidden in its teeth. A world where simplicity was suspect, where neatness might draw suspicion, where hairlines whispered secrets about loyalty, humility, even rebellion. And yet, through all the sermons and shaming and spectacles, one truth quietly endured. No matter how hard the church tried to shave away the self, a part of every priest remained, untamed. That soft rebellion, the refusal to disappear, entirely lingered like incense in the rafters. So tonight, let your thoughts settle on that last comb, lying beneath the cloisters, untouched. Not as a threat, not as vanity, but as a whisper from another time. A reminder that identity, even in the tightest robes of duty, still finds a way to breathe. Let your breathing slow. Let the images fade like mist off the grass. The sermons grow quieter now. The judgments soften. The weight of history eases into stillness. And somewhere, perhaps not so far away, a tired old priest smooths his fringe, lays down his comb, and finally sleeps without fear. You can too. The story is finished. The bell won't ring again tonight. You're safe now. You're home. And tomorrow, the past will still be there gentler in the morning light.